Welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Bobby Marlin. I'm the archivist for the Blocker History of Medicine collections. The Moody Medical Library proudly presents the third annual Blocker History of Medicine lecture. We are fortunate to have as tonight's speaker, Dr. Heather Green Wooten. Some of you may recognize her. Dr. Wooten earned a PhD in medical humanities from UTMB in 2006. Her book, The Polio Years in Texas, Battling a Terrifying Unknown, was awarded the 2009 T.R. Fehrenbach Book Award, given by the Texas Historical Commission. In addition, it also won the Otis Locke Endowment Award, Best Book category for 2009-2010, given by the East Texas Historical Association. Both awards were based upon outstanding original research and writing of Texas history. Dr. Wooten currently teaches American and Texas history at San Jacinto College South. She remains an associate for the Houston-based history consulting firm W.H. Keller Consulting. She is active in several historical organizations, holding offices in the Galveston Historical Foundation and the Galveston County Historical Commission. A public reception will be held in the Levin Hall foyer immediately following tonight's presentation, so please plan to join us. Again, thank you for coming, and please welcome Dr. Heather Green Wooten.
Thank you very much, Bobby and Brett and everyone who invited me here tonight. I'm thrilled, and for many reasons. It's because the Blocker collections played such an important role in my academic and professional life now since the fall of 1997, which, believe it or not, has been now 15 years ago. But that is when I began my doctoral studies here at the IMH, and my primary interest at the time was medical history. And so Chester Burns was my mentor, and anyone who was under Chester Burns as a graduate student certainly remembers being his research assistant on that very comprehensive centennial history of UTMB. But he also sent me to the archives for a lot of other interesting topics, such as the John Seeley Training School for Nurses, which was very interesting, and other sexy topics such as the sanitation in Galveston was another one. But my doctoral dissertation, when it was time for that, I needed a topic. And my graduate studies at UTMB had sparked my interest regarding the way that certain diseases affected American culture. And none did so more in the 20th century, with the exception of AIDS, than epidemics of poliomyelitis. And what also interested me is how much that disease and the memories of that continues to resonate with anyone who lived during that period or has a very close relationship with a polio survivor. So my dissertation explored polio epidemics and community response in Harris and Galveston County. And my research revealed that Harris and Galveston County area and Texas as a whole occupied a very important and unique role in the overall American experience of this disease. It was a story that had not been explored to any great length, and I thought needed to be told. And it also became very clear to me as I began my research that commenced in 2001 that polio survivors were aging, and they were passing away at a rapid pace. And many of those who did remain were starting to suffer from post-polio syndrome, or PPS. So I wanted to write the book in part as a tribute to those polio survivors. Now, before I leave this slide, I know y'all want to know who is this little girl here. And this little girl is Susan Edwards, and she was 2 years old when she found herself in an iron lung at Jefferson Davis Hospital in Houston during the epidemic of 1952. I am happy to say she did get out of this iron lung. In fact, there are pictures at the March of Dimes National Office that has her riding her tricycle. So just to let you know the background of that, because everyone is always very curious about that. But what made the polio experience in Texas unique? Well, on the most fundamental level, although the epidemic polio was a national problem, I think a lot of Texans just really do not realize that except for California, This state was the hardest hit in the nation. The first epidemic we had was 1937. Polio first appeared in Texas in 1913, but our first epidemic was 1937. And by World War II, seasonal epidemics were becoming very commonplace in Texas. As you can see there, they're occurring throughout the state. They're occurring in Amarillo, in San Antonio, in Dallas, the Rio Grande Valley, El Paso, Odessa, and of course Galveston had 4 epidemics. Why, you might ask, has to do with immigration, had a lot to do with it. Viral diseases often migrate from one geographical region to another, and the stimulus for relocation occurs when most susceptible persons have established immunity from an encounter, and however serious or mild that might be. And the virus returns with the appearance of a fresh crop of vulnerable individuals, either through birth or immigration. And nothing stirred up the Texas population in the first part of the 20th century than the oil boom and then World War II. Between those two things, you had large numbers of people moving from state to state, from rural to urban areas, and the large-scale mixing of people from endemic to epidemic areas caused a dramatic increase in polio incidence from across the state. Now, given those reasons, then, it's not surprising at all that Houston and Harris County were the hardest hit of all, with epidemics every other year during the peak polio years from 1942 to 1955. With the exception of Los Angeles County, California, no other county in the nation suffered epidemics with such frightening regularity. Now, during these epidemics in Texas, the disease characteristics adhered to the traditional pattern that's going on everywhere else. For reasons that still remain a mystery, incidences of polio usually appeared in May, peaked during those hot summer months, and then disappeared in October. Struck more boys than girls. It invaded households, regardless of race, neighborhood, or social class. Victims would complain of weariness, backache, stiff neck. Vast majority of cases, the disease did not progress beyond those flu-like symptoms. However, for approximately 10% of these victims, paralysis would set in, and the stricken regained their mobility with very mild effects. For others, approximately 3%, the paralysis was permanent. And that ranged from everything from an affected limb to wholesale paralysis from neck down, requiring or even with your lungs paralyzed and diaphragm, and requiring a respirator, or what we would call an iron lung, to breathe. So that's it on the fundamental level. But what sources did I use to carve out the story and dig deeper? Well, even though polio was very widespread, primary material was far more difficult to find than I first supposed. Much of it had been thrown out with the Salk and Sabin vaccines. And then, of course, we had to have our natural Texas disasters, such as the San Marcos River that overflowed in the mid-1990s, that took this just wonderful treasure trove of material from the Galveston Warm Springs Hospital and took it downriver. And then, of course, we remember Tropical Storm Allison that gave the Texas Medical Libraries a kick. But still, there was information out there, and it led me to several trips out of state and also in-state as well, where I explored government and university and local libraries. And I found some gems. And out of state was the FDR Presidential Library. I found this wonderful stash of letters from FDR to polio survivors and parents and friends. There was an exchange there, and those were absolutely marvelous. And then the March of Dimes National Archive in White Plains, New York, had a lot of material on the epidemic response in Texas, and that's where I got a lot of my photographs as well, including the one for the cover of the book, which was the one on the first slide. On the local level, you had the McGovern collections that had a good amount of material on the Southwestern Poliomyelitis Respiratory Center, and then, of course, the Blocker collections, which I will get to in a moment. But the information that I gleaned from these collections, whether they were bits and pieces or whether they were substantial files, enabled me to weave the polio experience in Texas and explore it through a variety of lenses. You could see regional, institutional, personal, and professional. And researching the topic through these multiple lenses created this in-depth understanding of the historical events that occurred. And so in addition to these archival materials that I found, I also had one very important element, and that came out to be the most rewarding part of my book, certainly of my research, which involved the opportunity to relate the polio experience through the voices that lived it. I gathered 40+ oral history interviews that represented a diverse encounters with the disease, everything from your polio survivors, their parents, their siblings, physicians, nurses, other caregivers, your fundraising volunteers, and even your researchers. And so they were inclusive of everything from a polio survivor who continues to this day to spend the vast majority of his existence in an iron lung, and his primary caregiver is now his 87-year-old father, to a prominent Houston physician who helped spearhead this groundbreaking institution at the Texas Medical Center. The combination of my archival research with these wonderful multiple oral histories helped support each lens of this mosaic. Now, my search for first-hand accounts of this disease led me to a couple of polio survivors that enriched my work tremendously. And lo and behold, who would they be but members of the Blocker family? I was very delighted to include Dr. Virginia Blocker, who is the wife of Truman G. Blocker, the founder of the Blocker collections, and her oldest son, Truman G. Blocker III, known as Bo. Both individuals were victims of polio, Virginia during the Galveston epidemic of 1943, and Bo the following year when the family was residing in Franklin, Indiana. Now I'll get to that in a moment. But their recorded memories provided a unique insight into the polio experience through these multiple perspectives or lenses. And so much of the polio narrative in this lecture is going to be related through their voices. Now, before I leave, that is Virginia Blocker and Truman Blocker on her graduation day in 1939 from UTMB. By this time, her son Bo has already been born. And so this is in happy times. Now, any individual who remembers the polio years remembers the fear that disease instilled. Although it was widely known that throughout the polio years that the disease was caused by a virus, no one knew for sure how it was contracted. All they knew is that it was highly contagious, it struck without warning, and had a cruel preference for children and young adults. There were always new fears and rumors, Dr. Virginia Blocker remembered. Sometimes it seems that was all we talked about. She remembers a list of rumors and preventives at the time. She remembers the wearing of facial hair was called into question for men. Some in the medical community thought mustaches or beards were transmitters of the polio virus, while other ones believed that you grew one to protect yourself. While women worried about facial hair or whether or not to grow it, women discussed the wearing of pants as a possible preventive. According to Virginia, there was a lobbying effort at UTMB during the war for women to wear pants, which was certainly not the dress code at the time, and to prevent them from getting polio. I could find nothing else about that, so if anyone knows that, please step forward and say so, But I just know from her word that was going on. She also remembered that nurses wore street clothes on their way to hospitals in order to be admitted on the bus, and children used the threat of polio to tease others in their play. But wherever polio struck, self-imposed quarantine was the order of the day. Swimming pools, theaters, other entertainment venues closed, Your public schools and your Sunday schools were dismissed as well at times. All children were kept indoors, and newspapers reported a daily tally of polio cases, including the names, ages, and addresses of those victims as a warning to others. Even though the fear of insects insects do not carry polio, and that was known by 1950, no one was taking chances, and certainly not around here either. And DDT was sprayed regularly from North Houston to Galveston Bay. Now, during the deadly epidemic of San Angelo in 1949, which this slide is showing you, citizens carried it even further. They were so afraid of contracting polio that they refused to talk on the telephone for fear that polio might transmit through the phone lines. And anyone who's driving through San Angelo during that hot summer did so with their windows rolled up. Keep in mind that's before air conditioning was in cars, and you didn't stop to put air in your tires either, for fear you might be taking it out with you in your tires. But the fear of the disease was not consigned to the lay population either. As Texas hospitals often staggered under a sudden influx of patients, physicians and caregivers treated, they soothed, they consoled, while having their own fears of contracting the disease, or maybe even more horrific, taking it home with them. Virginia Blocker remembered that many medical personnel were even fearful of touching the iron lungs at one time. But the fear of polio is not the only part of this story. It was a response to this disease by the medical community that laid the foundation for significant medical legacies. It hastened the development of rehabilitation medicine, gave birth to the modern intensive care unit, and it transformed the field of virology. And the Texas experience, including certain initiatives sponsored by UTMB, profoundly contributed to these developments. For instance, in response to the rapidly growing number of polio cases in Texas, Dallas orthopedic surgeon William Beale Carroll and the Scottish Rite Masons founded the Texas Scottish Rite Hospital for crippled children in 1923. And it became the first hospital in Texas devoted entirely to the rehabilitation of the disabled, and polio patients comprised 80 to 90% of the caseload during the polio years. Then you have Gonzalez Warm Springs Hospital in Austin, Texas, founded in 1937 by a group of Texas businessmen and physicians. And the facilities at this hospital, including the hydrotherapeutic pools with water piped in from the nearby warm springs, these 147-degree pools, were part of the facility, and they're all patterned after those at President Franklin Roosevelt's Warm Springs Retreat in Georgia. This hospital and its counterpart, Roosevelt Warm Springs, were the only two rehabilitation hospitals devoted solely to polio patients in the United States. And it was a product of New Deal initiatives. The Civilian Conservation Corps cleared the land. The National Youth Administration built the buildings. It opened adjacent to the Palmetto State Park, which was another CCC project. But then you had the Children's Hospital at UTMB was home of one of the first permanent polio wards in Texas. The hospital itself was built in 1937, and it was built with funding from, again, New Deal Initiative, the Public Works Administration, and the Texas Legislature. This is not the Children's Hospital. This is the FDRs Caravan visiting UTMB and going by the Women's Hospital. I did not have a picture of FDR at the Children's Hospital, even though I do understand that he did visit it in 1937. But during the epidemic of 1943 in Galveston, the polio ward was created on the first floor of the Children's Hospital under the direction of UTMB professor of orthopedic surgery, Dr. George Eggers. The ward operated in conjunction with the pediatric physical therapy department. Accessible to the polio ward was a therapeutic pool and massage rooms, a brace factory, a diet kitchen. It It had 86 beds, and 50 of them went to disabled children who were mostly suffering the after effects of polio. And of course, this ward also had an additional notoriety that you often get in Galveston, which was it was a victim of a massive hurricane. Of course. In 1943, a hurricane in July crashed into the island, and of course all the wonderful characteristics of the water rising and windows shattering and plaster falling and UTMB interns and residents carrying these very frightened polio victims to safety in the isolation ward. And then in the epidemic of 1945, the children's ward is out of commission for 2 years. Here comes another epidemic just 2 years later, and the isolation ward served as the polio ward until 1948, when, with the help of funds from the Seeley and Smith Foundation and the Galveston chapter of the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, or March of Dimes, the ward at the Children's Hospital became a permanent fixture. And Clifford Grewley was the supervisor at the time. He was assistant professor of pediatrics. In 1948 as well, Houston acquired their own permanent polio ward at Jefferson Davis Hospital. Okay, so using the patients and caregiver lenses, let's look at what was going on in the Blocker household during that time. Virginia, as I said, contracted polio in the epidemic of 1943. And while working during the war as a hospital administrator at John Seeley, she was exposed to patients on a regular basis, including children. And Truman Blocker, Colonel Truman Blocker, at this point, was away. He was stationed at Wakeman General Convalescent Hospital at Camp Atterbury, near Franklin, Indiana. So alone with 2 children by this time, Virginia remembers being very anxious, dreary, fatalistic, and Colonel Blocker came home. He returned on leave, and Virginia remembers that Truman came on a military plane, and the pilot, who was a friend, made it a miserable, terrifying ride to get his mind off of what he might encounter at home. Now, Virginia's paralysis was temporary, but as you can see in that bottom picture, she's quite thin. You can tell she has been through an illness. And as she said, I don't think you ever recover completely, even if your paralysis was temporary. There's residual damage, certainly emotional and physical. She said she had trouble with everything from walking, turning, balancing, moving, digesting food. She said the list just went on and on. But Virginia's case was not a solitary one. During the polio years, the fear of other UTMB caregivers was also confirmed. During the Galveston epidemic of 1948, you had Dr. Martin Schneider, who was chairman of the UTMB Department of Radiology, suffered an attack of acute poliomyelitis that left him confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. And also during one particularly frightening month, during December of 1951 to January 1952, during that month, polio struck 19 members of the UTMB medical community or their immediate family. In the year following Virginia's illness, the disease made a cruel return to the Blocker household. By 1944, the Blocker family had set up temporary residence in Franklin, Indiana, to be near Colonel Blocker for the remainder of his service at Wakeman Hospital. And it was during that time that 5-year-old Bo had contracted paralytic poliomyelitis and found himself unable to walk. And Virginia was devastated, she remembered. She said, as bad as it feels to have the dreaded disease yourself, you just feel terrible when it happens to your own child. The key assumption within the American value scheme is that misfortune doesn't happen to those who take precautionary measures. And many parents, therefore, blame themselves for dropping the ball if their children came down with it. But whether they believe that or not, regardless, when polio entered the household, parents launched a vicious counterattack in hopes of preventing its spread to other family members. And Bo Blocker remembered, "Mother wanted to burn everything. I watched many of my possessions go up in flames in the family fireplace, my sheets, my pajamas, even my beloved comic book collection just went up in flames. And there were hundreds of them," he remembered. "And I dreamed about those stories for years." Bo had developed a serious case that had left him dependent on crutches for a while. And upon the Blockers' return to Galveston at the end of World War II, Dr. Truman Blocker decided to think out of the box. And he championed a unique form of physical therapy for his son. He had observed, while he was in the service, these physical benefits of trampoline jumping. And certainly, how that trained pilots for aerial orientation. And he saw what a great, benefit it was. It gave this vigorous developmental exercise for the legs, helped with body control, rhythmic movements, coordination. And so he advocated trampoline exercises as the primary form of rehabilitation for Bo. And so as Bo remembered, the trampoline in the Blocker backyard was the first one in Galveston. And it was built, as he said, to my dad's specifications by Farmers Marine and Copper Works. If any of y'all remember Farmers Marine and Copper Works, yep. He says, "I later did all kinds of diving, which meant backflips, somersaults, gainers, all that, to my dad's delight. He would show me off to his friends and fellow physicians and tell them about my polio while I'm performing. And by the time I was in junior high," he remembered, "I was able to play football, so I didn't have any permanent disability except the fact that I was always a very slow runner." Now, his sister Ann had a different take on this, and she said, "That's all true with the trampoline, but denial was our primary rehabilitation plan." In a world long before the Americans with Disabilities Act, successful integration into the American mainstream was extreme importance. And it was very important to shroud your disability under a veil of being as normal as possible. And these polio survivors underwent physical therapy where healthy muscles, they learned for healthy muscles to compensate for damaged ones. But of course, it's going to depend on how debilitated you were as to how normal you can behave or carry it off. But everyone did as much as they could to their ability. And many polio survivors developed these type A personalities to fit in. And they were hard driving, they were self-denying, and they were overachieving. Virginia and Bo fit that pattern. Virginia rarely mentioned her illness, if at all. In fact, Bo didn't even know his own mother had polio until his late teens, so that tells you something. And of course, you had Bo at 5'7", became an all-state basketball player. And so he drove himself as well. But okay, now returning to these medical legacies for a moment, and the role of Texans in developing them, in the same manner that Virginia and Bo Blocker had, most of their polio cases were temporary. But as the polio years progressed, the disease began to attack increasing numbers of patients who were becoming victims of bulbar polio, which paralyzes the lungs and the diaphragm and muscles used for breathing, or the worst you could possibly have, which was bulbar spinal, where your limbs are paralyzed, and then also you cannot breathe as well. And of course, on both instances, you need the iron lung. And iron lung patients, though, required this aggressive round-the-clock care that most hospitals didn't have the funding, they didn't have the equipment, nor the staff to handle that situation. So it can be a very dangerous predicament. And it's putting numerous lives in jeopardy. If you're needing a hospital and they have only 3 iron lungs during a sudden epidemic, then you're going to have some trouble there. The overall mortality rate for polio was just 10%, but 60% of bulbar patients lost their lives to the disease. So what to do about that. But in 1950, the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis began to establish respiratory centers throughout the country to address this issue. And what they did, as the last slide showed you, is put iron lungs side by side in one room with a nurse for every two, and that concentrated care caused this mortality rate to plummet to 8%. So this highly aggressive care that these iron lungs received became the forerunner of our modern intensive care units. There were 14 of these centers established throughout the country. Houston, with its record for epidemics, of course, is going to become the home of the first center of its kind. The Southwestern Poliomyelitis Respiratory Center was one of the largest, and it was affiliated with the Baylor College of Medicine and Jefferson Davis Hospital. Okay, now our final legacy. Texas played this major role in the search for a vaccine. Microbiology grew as a science out of efforts to develop effective containment for the disease. And throughout the late 1940s, UTMB virologist Dr. Morris Pollard made a number of discoveries in his virus research laboratory that provided pieces to the complex polio puzzle. Most important of all those was characterizing the importance of the GI tract in the propagation and the spread of polio. Houston, in 1952, was the chosen location for the gamma globulin field trials. In 1953, Jonas Salk, who was head of the virus research laboratory at the University of Pittsburgh, developed a virus vaccine using virulent forms of polio that had been cured with formaldehyde. And so to truly test that effectiveness, he needed to test it with a large group of human subjects. And so school children from 10 Texas counties, as well as many others throughout the country, were chosen to participate in the Salk vaccine field trial known as Operation Polio. I want to stop for a minute. Is anyone a polio pioneer in here? Sometimes they are. First, second, or third grader in 1954. Okay. Sometimes there are definitely people who remember that and still even have their buttons, which is even better. But Texas in 1955, when it was proven safe, your Texas physicians and citizens ensured the widespread implementation of the vaccine. But while all this is going on, while Jonas Salk is reaping this national and international acclaim for his vaccine, Albert Sabin, who is professor of research pediatrics at the University of Cincinnati, is laboring to perfect his live virus vaccine. And this is where Texans come in. In 1962, research conducted by Drs. Joseph Melnick and Russell Blattner at the Baylor College of Medicine proved the herd immunity theory and the safety and effectiveness of the Sabin vaccine. These important efforts, spearheaded by Texas physicians and researchers, leads me now to my greatest gem of the Blocker collections research, and that is the story of Dr. Ardruzny Pakchanian and the cotton rat. In a just world, the polio studies conducted by Pollard, Salk, Sabin, and others would have been heralded as an extension of groundbreaking experiments initiated by Pakchanian, who spent many years as a UTMB microbiologist and professor of bacteriology. And I learned through my exploration of a small but significant stash of Pakchanian's papers in the Blocker collections that, unfortunately for Pakchanian, for UTMB, and Texas, scientific deception trumped ethical conduct. In other words, life is not fair at all, and I'm about to tell you why. Okay. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, intensive polio studies remained hampered by a lack of trial subjects. Monkeys were the only reliable vector for growing mass quantities of poliovirus for research, and working with monkeys could be a nightmare. You needed a lot of them to produce enough poliovirus for an extensive trial. They were expensive, they were hard to procure, usually had to get them from Asia, and once they came, they were either dead or very sick. And even if they had survived the trip to the laboratory, and were in decent health, they bit. And researchers could count, therefore, on countless weeks of dirty, dangerous work with these monkeys. So there is a need for a viable alternative for polioviral testing. And in 1936, Pakchanian found it in the cotton rat. But credit is going to go to a prominent research scientist by the name of Charles Armstrong. Now, how did that all come about? Well, in the mid-1930s, Pakchanian was working for the NIH, and he'd made experimental injections of poliovirus in a species of rats and mice, and he wasn't getting very far with it. Most rodent varieties cannot be grown in captivity, and he was trying to find a group that could. And he had success rearing this large group of cotton rats. And early experimentation showed that these rodents might very well be susceptible to the poliovirus. Now, Pakchanian's research intrigued his NIH colleague, Armstrong, who had already received international acclaim for his discovery of the virus that caused neurological diseases such as meningitis and encephalitis. So he's a big gun at the INH by now. And so when Armstrong offers his laboratory to Pakchanian, well, he's elated, to have this acknowledgement and this possible camaraderie with this guy. And so he even said, I had a feeling of teamwork and thought that the problem of finding a susceptible animal belonged to both of us. Now, the experiments are going to be complex. They required the injection of a rare and less dangerous type of poliovirus known as the Lansing, or later known as type 2, into the brains of 30 strains of these cotton rats. But the specimens are beginning to display poliovirus symptoms. And the discovery that a human strain of poliovirus could be transmitted to cotton rats was monumental. Because at last, you now have a disease that can be studied in a far cheaper way than the monkey. And it's also going to stimulate efforts and ways to adapt and establish other types of poliovirus, often those that are much more dangerous, into animals, and then paving the way for finding an effective vaccine. So the results of the cotton rat project promise scientific acclaim for the primary researchers, at least one of them. Two events in Pakchanian's life are going to throw a real monkey wrench into what he's seeing is going to be great acclaim. 3 years into this project, Pakchanian received an invitation from UTMB President John Spees, this is 1939, to join the medical school faculty here at UTMB. And shortly after that interview, I don't think he drank any bad coffee or anything, but he did become very ill, resulting in a very lengthy hospital stay for about 2 months. What he had, there's no record of that. But he's holed up in the hospital for 2 months, and once he returns to the NIH, the situation has changed. The whole environment is different. And he learns that Armstrong has written this preliminary report discussing in very deep detail these experiments. But lo and behold, Pakchanian's contributions, or even his name, is deleted from the whole thing, except for the person who collected the rats, and oh yeah, that's Pakchanian, but the rest is Armstrong. So Pakchanian confronted Armstrong. He says, "Did you think I was going to die? What became of our polio work?" And he said, he recorded, "For the first time I saw Armstrong blush." And he stated that the IMH director, Richard Dyer, had canceled my name from the report. And of course, Dyer denies that, but I'd say it's plausible. because Dyer's knowledge of the researcher's imminent move to Galveston is going to motivate him. That's got to keep the credit for such a momentous discovery as this within the NIH. Well, of course, the outcome was a boon for Armstrong, who proceeded to successfully transmit the Lansing strain to white mice. But more importantly, here he is elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 1944, the Polio Hall of Fame in 1956, and Pakchanian, doesn't get any of that. But he does move on as well. Here at UTMB, he enjoyed a satisfactory career as a national and international researcher. But he never got over Armstrong's betrayal. And 20 years after those original experiments, Philip Blossom, who was a fellow researcher who was working in the lab at the NIH when all this was going on, and he wrote to Pakchanian, and he said, "It is a great disappointment to me, as I know it is to you, to have the record so distorted. Important discoveries such as this are not everyday occurrences in the life of a scientist, and after one has worked so hard to accomplish something, it must be disheartening not to be identified with it." Pakchanian agreed, and he wrote back, "Credit should be given where credit is due. The original cotton rats were collected by Philip Blossom, and systematic study of the susceptibility of rodents to polio was all done by the writer. Armstrong only quickly collected the cream." But Pakchanian's not through. Shortly before Armstrong's introduction into the Polio Hall of Fame, Pakchanian wrote the honoree, "I am sure, even though belated, if you see proper opportunity to correct the early mistake or misunderstanding by yourself, it will show that you have that admirable quality one required for the true scientists of selflessness." Pakchanian never received a reply. So in my view, Armstrong not only plagiarized Pakchanian's work, but his and Dyer's conduct robbed UTMB of an outstanding role in polio vaccine research. Perhaps it could have generated funding, staff, and institutional resources for UTMB and the South Texas region. Now, what can we make of the Blocker and Pakchanian experiences? What can we learn from viewing their stories from all four lenses? The regular onslaught of polio epidemics throughout Texas gave birth to medical and community resources essential to the effective research and treatment of this disease. At the heart of these legacies are these poignant personal narratives conveyed by patients and family members, caregivers, and researchers who experienced life in the polio trenches. Nowhere in my research did I find a Texas story that so beautifully represented all four lenses than here at UTMB. While the Blocker and Pakchanian stories fit the overall Texas narrative, they also offer a very unique synthesis of local historical significance. At the epicenter of all four lenses is our beloved Old Red, my current book project, and the newest edition of the Fred Ryder Cotton Popular History Series published by the Texas State Historical Association. All of the lenses that made up the mosaic of the polio story were funneled through this historical landmark. The Blocker Collections has been instrumental in creating this manuscript, from administrative records to student and faculty reminiscences to an exceptional collection of historical photographs. And the archive has been an invaluable asset to my research of past, present, and hopefully future projects. The warm welcome by Brett Kirkpatrick, the excellent professional assistance by Sarita Ortling and Bobby Marlin have provided a great service to my endeavors. And I give a deepest gratitude to the faculty and staff of the IMH for their everlasting support. And finally, a very posthumous nod to the man who introduced me to this marvelous resource years ago, and whose portrait hangs in the reception area of the Blocker Collections, Dr. Chester Burns. Thank you very much.